presiding.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning, John.
Please be seated. Thank you so much. We're here this morning on Nouman Raja. Stand your ground motion. State's here, defense is here, defendant is here. So in preparation for the hearing today, I've read the motion, the amended motion, the state's response, the defendant's reply, the deposition of Wilfred Libby. I've read, obviously, all the applicable case law, including a case that came out on Thursday out of the 2nd DCA regarding Stand Your Ground, Martin v. State. I have copies for the parties here, a copy for the state, copy for the defense, that discusses the retroactivity of the June Stand Your Ground statute. I've, of course, read all the applicable 4th DCA case law. I've read case law from the 4th DCA regarding the clear and convincing standard. I've reviewed McDaniel, Dennis, and all the other cases that are applicable to Stand Your Ground. Now, as we all know, in a criminal prosecution, once a prima facie claim of self-defense immunity for criminal prosecution has been raised by the defendant at a pretrial immunity hearing, the burden of proof by clear and convincing evidence is on the party seeking to overcome the immunity from criminal prosecution. So, at this time, defense, how would you like to proceed?
Your Honor, I have one preliminary matter that I want to bring to the attention of the court. Thank you for providing the Martin case. We found it ourselves, and we provided it to the state this morning, and it does conform with this court's earlier rulings regarding retroactivity. On last week, we were also provided a case. May I approach the court?
Thank you.
And this has also been provided to the state. On the very last page of the state's response, they raised the issue of timeliness of the filing of the motion. They said a Stand Your Ground immunity motion is a 3.190B motion, which technically must be raised either before or at arraignment unless the court grants further time, and that this motion was filed after arraignment. We found no case law on that other than a Sarasota County Circuit Appellate Division case, which came out on March 12, 2018, entitled Munoz Varela versus State. It's obviously not binding on this court, not even persuasive, but I wanted to bring it to the court's attention because it is a case which is in support of the state's position. We would argue that there's no appellate case which states what the Munoz Varela case states, that every case that we're aware of where Stand Your Ground motion was filed, it was filed after arraignment. This court has heard and ruled on motions that were filed after arraignment, and that there could not possibly be a way that a motion of this type could be filed before or at arraignment without even discovery. So I just wanted to bring it to the attention of the court because it is contrary case law. And
I appreciate that.
Anything further?
I agree there's no 4th DCA case law regarding this issue, but as you appropriately and correctly stated, I've heard numerous Stand Your Ground motions that have been filed after arraignment, and I obviously intend on hearing one today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Unless State, do you want to be heard on that issue?
No, Your Honor.
Okay. All right. So in light of that, defense, how would you like to proceed with the motion?
An opening statement, Your Honor?
Sure.
And also for the record, Your Honor, over the weekend, the defense filed a motion for production of video evidence. We are now withdrawing that motion.
Okay. I saw it literally this morning.
Yes, Your Honor.
You worked it out?
Yes.
Okay. Excellent.
Right. Good morning. May it please the court?
Sure.
Nouman Raja seeks dismissal of all charges in this case. He is immune from prosecution under Florida's Stand Your Ground law, and he is entitled to dismissal because he acted in lawful self-defense. He was in fear of imminent death or great bodily harm when he shot Mr. Corey Jones. His actions are to be evaluated from the perspective of a reasonable police officer who had to make a split-second decision when faced with a gun pointed directly at him, and not from the perspective of 20/20 hindsight. It's from the perspective of what was happening at that instant. He was justified in the use of deadly force regardless of what the state may claim as failures to follow accepted police practices in his initial approach to Mr. Jones. He was justified because he believed Mr. Jones was going to kill him. Both the facts and the law support dismissal. It's undeniable that the death of Mr. Jones is tragic. But emotion and sympathy, while natural, cannot be considered in this proceeding. The facts and the law are what govern. And under the law, Mr. Raja is a person entitled to the protection of the Stand Your Ground law. Now, of course, as the court stated earlier, that law requires the state to prove by clear and convincing evidence that the use of deadly force was not justifiable. And if the state is unable to do that, the remedy is dismissal. Mr. Raja is entitled to immunity and dismissal because, as a person, he reasonably believed that deadly force was necessary to defend himself against the threat of imminent death or great bodily harm. And as a police officer, he is entitled to immunity and dismissal under state law and federal constitutional law. Now, the court is obviously aware of the case of State versus Peraza, which was decided by the 4th District Court of Appeal. And Peraza tells us two things. Number one, a police officer is entitled to the protection of the Stand Your Ground law. And two, the analysis of a police officer's use of force in a criminal case is based on federal constitutional standards as set forth in U.S. Supreme Court cases of Graham v. Garner and Tennessee v. Garner. The analysis of whether a police officer's use of force was objectively reasonable, that's the analysis. But the defense doesn't have to prove that. The state has to prove by clear and convincing evidence that Mr. Raja is not entitled to immunity because his use of force was not objectively reasonable. Factually, on October 15, 2015, Nouman Raja was an on-duty police officer with the Palm Beach Gardens Police Department. His assignment was working an auto burglary detail. He was assigned an unmarked van so that he could do his surveillance without being spotted as a police officer. He was dressed in a T-shirt, jeans, and a baseball cap. He had a firearm in a belt holster. He was driving westbound on PGA Boulevard, approaching the I-95 overpass. He saw a vehicle parked on the west side of the southbound off-ramp from I-95 to PGA Boulevard. He radioed his sergeant that he was going to check it out, and his sergeant gave him the go-ahead signal, 10-4. Officer Raja made a U-turn on PGA and then headed westbound. There was no traffic. He drove northbound in the southbound lanes of the off-ramp because otherwise he would have had to have gone northbound on I-95, all the way up to Donald Ross Road, get back on 95 southbound, and then get off at PGA, losing valuable time. He drove past the median and turned left toward the vehicle just off the ramp. He believed that the vehicle was unoccupied. As he approached it, the driver's door suddenly swung open, and the driver got out. Mr. Raja quickly braked and threw the van into park. He opened his door and came around the front of his van. He had no time to put his vest on because once Mr. Jones got out of his vehicle, Mr. Raja had to assume that it was a threat. It happened very, very fast. This was an exigent circumstance, an emergency, and once that door opened, everything changed, Your Honor. As it turned out, Mr. Raja was correct in assessing the threat because Mr. Jones got out of his vehicle with a loaded gun, which the evidence will show he bought several days prior. The driver of the other vehicle was on the other side of the driver's door. Mr. Raja said, "Police, can I help you?" Mr. Jones responded by saying, "Huh?" or something similar to that. And you'll hear audio of what transpired because Mr. Jones was on the phone, his cell phone, with AT&T Roadside Assistance, and his cell phone was picking up some of the audio at the scene. That audio was given to a defense expert who enhanced it. And that expert will testify that once enhanced, a human voice can be heard just prior to Mr. Jones saying, "Huh?" We can't hear exactly what was said, but it was definitely a human voice. And the human voice was not Mr. Jones's voice. It was consistent with Mr. Raja's voice. This evidence will demonstrate that the microphone on Mr. Jones's cell phone did not pick up Mr. Raja's voice until he was close to the cell phone. The reason that is significant is because the state's entire theory is based upon a false premise. Their claim is that Mr. Raja didn't identify himself, and that set in motion a series of events which resulted in the death of Mr. Jones. But the evidence is clear that a human voice is heard on that recording, and that corroborates Mr. Raja's statement to investigators that he identified himself, putting the state's entire case in doubt. There was a brief verbal exchange between Mr. Raja and Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones pointed a firearm at Mr. Raja, and I will quote exactly from the audio. Mr. Raja drew his firearm and yelled, "Get your fucking hands up." Mr. Jones did not put his hands up as ordered. Mr. Jones, still pointing the gun at Nouman Raja, said, "Hold on, hold on." And Mr. Raja said, "Get your fucking hands up, drop." Mr. Jones did not put his hands up or drop his gun. Fearing he was going to be killed, Mr. Raja fired 3 times at Mr. Jones. And when Mr. Jones pointed a firearm at Mr. Raja, that constituted the use of deadly force, and Mr. Raja was authorized by law to reply with deadly force. Mr. Jones turned and ran northwest into the grassy area on the west side of the off-ramp. He spun around and pointed his gun at Mr. Raja again. Fearing imminent death or great bodily harm, Mr. Raja fired 3 more times. He saw Mr. Jones stop, but he lost sight of him. He immediately called 911 from the cell phone that he had in his pocket and reported that he had discharged a firearm. He continued to shout commands at Mr. Jones because he couldn't see him in the darkness. Backup units, supervisors, and eventually PBSO investigators arrived on the scene, and Mr. Jones' gun was located between his vehicle and where his body was found. Now, several hours after the incident, Mr. Raja spoke to investigators on a walkthrough, which you'll see. And he told them that the gun that was pointed at him was equipped with a red laser. When he told that to investigators, he did not know that Mr. Jones's gun, which was found at the scene, did not have a laser sight. But there's no doubt that Mr. Raja is telling the truth because his statement is corroborated by further investigation. Within weeks of the incident, investigators from the State Attorney's Office and the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office went out to the scene at 1:30 in the morning with Mr. Jones's gun and videotaped what has been referred to as a light reflectivity test. Investigator Wills of the State Attorney's Office held Mr. Jones's gun up, positioning himself generally where Mr. Jones was standing, and pointed the gun at a crime scene investigator who was positioned generally where Mr. Raja was standing. This was videotaped. Behind Mr. Raja was a set of traffic signals. You'll see a video from that demonstration, Your Honor. And as Mr. Wills held the gun, and as the traffic lights turned red, they reflected off of Mr. Jones's gun. And the effect was just as if the gun had been equipped with a laser. The red lights from the traffic light flickered off of the gun as it was held by Mr. Wills, and also as he moved it around. Now, Mr. Raja didn't know that the gun that Mr. Jones pointed at him did not have a laser, so the state's demonstration verified exactly what Mr. Raja said. Mr. Jones pointed a gun at him, red lights flickered off that gun, and mimicked what a laser would look like. You'll learn more about the light reflectivity test. You will also learn that the participants, as I indicated, were officers or investigators from the State Attorney's Office and PBSO. And as the court is aware, the defense was not informed that there was a video of this light reflectivity test until almost 2 years after the incident, and it's highly exculpatory. It was revealed earlier this year and only after a specific demand had been made for it. As the court knows, there have been hearings devoted to evidence on the issue of how and exactly when Mr. Jones died. The local ME, Dr. Just, has opined that a bullet struck Mr. Jones underneath the right armpit and traversed his torso from right to left, damaging internal organs. That bullet had to have struck Mr. Jones as the right side of his body was facing Mr. Raja. And that is consistent with what Mr. Raja told investigators. That is, Mr. Jones spun and pointed his gun at Nouman Raja. His right arm was up, exposing the right side of his torso. Dr. Just has also opined, however, that the bullet that struck the right side of Mr. Jones's body caused such damage that once struck, Mr. Jones could only have been able to travel a few yards. In essence, she says that Mr. Jones fell dead within a few yards of where the bullet struck him on the right side. And as the court knows, after many hearings, the state has finally told the court that their theory is that the fatal shot was in the second volley of shots, either shot 4, 5, or 6. However, the state has also asked 2 other medical examiners in Florida to offer their opinions as to what Mr. Jones could or could not do once that chest wound was received. And both of them, Dr. John Thogmartin and Dr. Stephen Nelson, are of the opinion that Mr. Jones could have traveled a great distance once he was shot in the chest. That is the distance between where Nouman Raja says Mr. Jones spun and pointed the gun at him and where his body was found. A defense medical expert will also testify and agree with Dr. Thogmartin and Dr. Nelson. And this is significant because it demonstrates that the state initially had questions about Dr. Juice's opinion, and they have now abandoned those experts that they sought to consult. In addition to the defense audio expert and the defense expert medical examiner, the defense will present other experts. We will present experts in crime scene reconstruction. These experts will assist the court in understanding, based upon the physical evidence, how this incident occurred. We will present an expert in human factors to explain how being involved in a shooting affects a person's ability to accurately remember and recount some details of the shooting. The human factors expert is being presented to rebut the state's contention that Mr. Raja lied about how this incident occurred. He did not lie. His inaccuracies are common among police officers who have discharged their firearms in these life-threatening situations, which occur literally in split seconds. This is a normal reaction. And finally, the defense will present an expert in police shootings who will tell the court that the use of deadly force by Mr. Raja was justifiable under the governing law in the state of Florida and the federal constitutional standard which must be applied when analyzing whether the use of force was objectively reasonable, and which the state attorney's office itself uses in determining whether or not a shooting was justifiable. And that's the law as announced in several decisions, including the Peraza case. And so, Your Honor, respectfully, at the end of the hearing, it will be clear that the state will not be able to carry its burden by proving by clear and convincing evidence that Mr. Raja did not act in self-defense. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Richardson. State?
Thank you, Your Honor. Darling, from the table, or should me up at the...
It's better up here if you don't mind, please.
Thank you, Your Honor. Obviously, we're here for a stand your ground hearing and motion filed by the defense. And just, everybody's filed the motions, the responses to responses. I know Your Honor is very well aware, so I'll keep it brief and just really to the points. Reasonable person standard is what governs stand your ground hearings. We agree that the 4th DCA has made a finding on Peraza, which allows law enforcement to file a motion pursuant to stand your ground, and that's binding precedent as it stands today. We also agree that it's being heard and accepted up in the Supreme Court, and they will ultimately decide whether or not that is accurate and should follow through the statutory provisions by the legislature. But this is stand your ground. This is not civil court talking about law enforcement. This is not .05 law enforcement ability to defend themselves. This is stand your ground for a regular person. There's not some heightened standard that's provided to law enforcement pursuant to the statutory provisions. Objectively reasonable for the person. Now, Peraza discusses Graham, Garner, and that lineage of cases because it also discusses 776.05 about law enforcement self-defense. But when you look at the meat of the actual decision by that court, they're really focused on what is objectively reasonable, period. But also factually, it is very dissimilar to what we have here today. In that case, you have a very clearly identified law enforcement officer that is called to a scene about a threat of an individual with a firearm. So a heightened level of understanding of the type of threat that would be available to the regular citizens and the law enforcement officers themselves. Additionally, when that individual turns, there is danger not only to that officer, but to fellow officers and citizens and children that are around, and that has been understood through not just a few seconds in an approach, but many seconds and minutes of actually going to the scene and seeing the actions of that individual in Peraza. Completely factually dissimilar. So the reasonable actions of that officer, that person during Peraza, is going to be different than what the analysis and view of what a reasonable person objectively would be doing in the situation that we're in here, in which Corey Jones was unlawfully killed by the defendant. There was no identification by the defendant in this case. They can say there was, but there's no actual proof that he identified himself other than his statement, his inconsistent, unreliable statement that serves his best interests. He pulls up in an unmarked van in an entirely aggressive manner, which defies all logic and practices that are generally accepted in law enforcement when you approach any citizen, whether it's an unattended vehicle or whether it's an actual traffic stop. He gets out without actually wearing his tactical vest, his firearm that's issued, his ID, his radio, all things that he was ordered specifically to do in the capacity for which he was working, which was a plainclothes capacity in which he was supposed to be identifiable and identify himself as a law enforcement officer. His actions denoted not that of a law enforcement officer, but as a person aggressively approaching a citizen in the wee hours of the morning who was doing nothing but sitting there stranded himself. There's no way that Corey Jones would have known that that defendant was a law enforcement officer. They say that there's some voice that you're going to be hearing about this morning from an expert, that there's a voice right before Corey Jones says, huh. Well, I don't think we need thousands of dollars and an expert to come here and explain to the court that when you hear an individual say, huh, question mark, that somebody just approached him and said something. Of course there's a voice there. But also, the fact that Corey Jones is responding in that manner and initiating that conversation between himself and the defendant is evidence that he had no idea what that person just said. We don't agree that he actually announced who he was. He definitely didn't follow any type of practice or policy on doing what he should do as a law enforcement officer and taking cover behind the engine block of his van if he was that scared and clearly announce himself as a law enforcement officer and identify himself. He did nothing except recklessly run into a situation and caused an individual to get killed. There is actually a person here who has the right to stand their ground. Stand your ground absolutely exists in this case. And it's for Corey Jones. He was standing his ground when he faced an aggressive individual charging at him, armed, in the middle of the night. When Corey Jones was doing nothing except innocently waiting for some assistance so that he could get on with his evening and get to church the next day and play drums. He attempted to fight off this aggressive approach like any other citizen has a right to do under the Stand Your Ground. He is the person envisioned by the Stand Your Ground. The defendant's an initial aggressor. He doesn't get some type of heightened benefit by Stand Your Ground because he's a law enforcement officer. He is an initial aggressor, and he does not have a right to come here and have a case dismissed because of Stand Your Ground. The defense talks about how he immediately calls 911. What? Waiting almost a minute and ticking off that time in seconds to call 911 in the manner in which he began it, that's not immediate. That's not doing what a law enforcement officer does in order to try to attempt to then change into a life-saving mode. They say that laser studies corroborate what the defendant says. Just because the defendant gets one or two or a few things right in his statement doesn't mean that it's a credible statement. Doesn't mean that he's being truthful in his statement. Sure, he gets a few things right. Of course he's going to. But that does not take away from all the inconsistencies with his statement. And the defense is talking about that they're going to introduce this court about medical examiners and what we did in the state in our investigation. Of course, we're going to fully investigate the case. We're going to look at it for the good, the bad. It's not good or bad. It's evidence. It's the facts. It's what we can discern from what we have. And we thoroughly do that. But realistically, for the purposes of Stand Your Ground, a whole medical examiner testimony is irrelevant. Because what we're talking about here are the initial actions and the aggressive behavior of the defendant that does not allow him to avail himself to Stand Your Ground. Everything that happened as far as which shot actually resulted in the death. So I tell you again, I specifically don't know which shot. Yeah, we believe we have the evidence that it's the 4th, 5th, or 6th. I don't specifically know which one pursuant to the evidence. But for these purposes, it's immaterial. It's irrelevant. it doesn't matter for stand your ground. It will matter later on, but in the manner in which he is charged, actually, that's not a pivotal issue here, but not specifically here today. And any evidence that they have on the manner in which my office has treated officer-involved shootings is not only irrelevant, but it's inadmissible. The Office of the State Attorney reviews officer-involved uses of force, which result in death or great bodily harm, in a holistic manner. We look at everything surrounding it. All the case law, whether it was not just stand your ground, but 776.05 is really what we look at in the self-defense of law enforcement, how it would actually play out in a trial. Everything is viewed, and it's not just a singular stand your ground analysis. So to bring that up, it really is inadmissible in this case. We believe that we'll absolutely meet the burden that the law has provided to every citizen and every person. And at the end, there will very clearly be a person who stood their ground. But unfortunately, he's not with us today to be able to tell you exactly what happened.
Thank you, State. Defense, how would you like to proceed at this time?
Your Honor, just so you can follow along with some of our housekeeping preliminary introduction of items, I just want to tell you what we're about to do so you'll be able to put it in perspective, because some of this has been stipulated too that it can come in without a witness.
Sure.
We're going to introduce a series of photographs taken by various crime scene officers and personnel at the scene. We're going to put in the stack. As we go along, we'll use them, identify them, have people talk about them, et cetera, et cetera. But those are going to come into evidence. I think there's maybe 35.
Okay. And you've stipulated to that? State and defense? To those photos? Yes. Okay, so, okay.
Okay. Those will be a composite number H. These are going to be identified just for the record as composite 1A through H.
Okay.
The next thing and the first sounds you'll hear in the hearing is going to be a short clip of a radio call made by Officer Raja to his sergeant, telling him that he sees a car on the side of the off-ramp and he's going to check it out, to which the sergeant says 10-4. Just to set the stage for everything.
And is that's stipulated too?
Yes.
Okay.
The next thing is going to be a longer audio, and it's what's been referred to as a roadside assistance call made by Mr. Jones.
The AT&T call?
Yes.
Okay.
Or some people call it the Allied call, because the company, I think, that was monitoring it for AT&T is Allied, but it's that call where he's saying, I'm broken down on the side of the road. And that is going to be introduced and played in its entirety.
Okay. State, you agree to that as well?
Yes.
Okay.
And then finally, in terms of those kind of exhibits, the 911 call made by Officer Raja after the shooting, while it's still at least believed to be an active scene, that's going to be introduced and played too. So, just so wanted you to know, and then we'll start with the live witnesses. But that's going to, just listening to that and the roadside assistance call is going to take a while.
Okay, that's fine. Now, you said the photos are 1A through H. What about the rest of them? Did you say there were about 30 photos?
Well, a lot of those are going to be introduced in a different manner, and some
Okay.
may not introduce, but there were that many photos.
Okay.
The question is how many were you? Actually, there were hundreds of photos, but these are culled down from that. And then we're going to go through, starting with our witnesses.
Okay.
But, so first I would like to introduce, and I have, of course, copies for the state, Exhibit 1, A through H.
Comes in by stipulation, photos. Madam Clerk?
And I have a copy for the clerk and an extra copy for the judge if you want.
That would be excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much.
And as I've said, Your Honor, these photos show various aspects of the scene, Mr. Jones's car, the box that he had the gun in, the location of where the gun was found in the grass.
Okay.
And also the scene itself showing, at least as best the photograph can show, basically the broad view of what really the entire scene looks like. And that one, just for the court's record, is 1A.
Understood.
So I offer 1A through H.
Admitted by stipulation, A through H.
Next, we're going to offer the roadside assistance call, the CAD audio, the short little radio excerpt from Officer Raja to his sergeant, Sergeant Anderson, very short. I offer that into evidence as, I guess it should be marked for purposes of the hearing, so we'll call it Exhibit 2.
Sounds good. Comes in by stipulation.
And while I'm at it, we'll offer as Exhibit 3, or whatever number.
Three.
The 911 call, the roadside assistance call, and is Exhibit 4, the 911 call.
Okay, Exhibit 3 comes in, the roadside assistance AT&T call, and Exhibit 4 is the 911 call.
At this point, I'd like to play for the court that audio of the radio call from Raja to Anderson.
Okay, that's Exhibit 2.
Yes.
You may.
So just 1495 off-ramp to PGA. There is a great SUV parked on the off-ramp. On the side, I'm just going to go check out. Yeah.
The next thing that we are going to play for the court is the entirety of the AT&T roadside assistance call. Yeah, well, we're going to play an excerpt at this point, but the entire call is in evidence, but we're going to play the excerpt.
Okay, that's Exhibit 3. Sure.
Thank you for calling AT&T Roadside Assistance. This is Maddie. May I have your mobile number to better assist you?
561-573-2815.
Okay, give me one moment to pull up the account. And what's the name on it?
Corey Jones.
Okay.
Calvary.
Yeah, I see Delray Beach House.
Yeah.
Alright. And what can I do for you tonight?
I need to get a tow. I'm not
Okay.
broke down.
And is this mobile number with the vehicle?
Yes.
Okay. What's wrong with the vehicle?
It won't start.
Okay. And is it a four-wheel drive?
I think it's a little.
What's the address of the vehicle location?
I'm off the PGA southbound exit on 95.
On 95?
I-95 exit PGA southbound.
Okay, is there any, hold on, let me write southbound down. Is there any buildings, landmarks, anything like that, that I could use to pinpoint your address?
I'm good. Yeah, I'm good. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Where's the gun killer?
There'll be more later of that, but for now, that's what we introduced.
Okay.
At this point, we are going to play the 911 call made by.
That's my fucking gun right now! 911. This is gun Delta 1. I just got one down. I just shot one person. I'm at that offense right behind Doubletree, Blackdale.
You're behind the Doubletree?
I'm on the offense, 95 southbound offense, off the Doubletree. I am not coming to anything right now. And, give me some minutes. I got one down. I got one man down. Got five right now.
Roger, you all right?
Yeah, man, I'm good. I'm good. Drop it out.
On the off-ramp, right?
On the offense. Give me some units. I'm lost contact with him. I don't know where he is.
All right, you got it, buddy. Where's your radio? Where's your radio, Raj?
My radio's in the van right now. I don't have it with me. I'm on, that's on the phone.
All right, stay on the phone, buddy. What's the guy look like?
Black tailwind, all black dress, had a silver handgun in his right hand. I came out, I saw him come out with a handgun, I gave him commands, I identified myself, and he turned, pointed the gun at me, started running, I shot him. I've lost contact 65 to 28 on the SUV.
Go ahead.
It's going to be a Florida 28 of 286 Papa Romeo Hotel, 286 PR8.
Don't know yet. Spike, put that out now. All right, it's a 08 Hyundai 286 Papa Romeo Hotel.
Yes, 286.
All right, it's coming back on a four-door Hyundai gray.
Yeah, SUV.
Yeah, it's out of Lake Worth. It's not stolen or anything.
All right, man.
All right, stay on the phone. Where's the van at? Where's your van at? In the Doubletree lot?
No, right on the offense. You'll see my van right there. I'm walking back to my van. I'm back to my van in the car.
All right.
He's been at least 3 to 4 times.
All right, you got your radio now?
No. Hold on. Not yet.
All right. I got units coming.
All right, man. Thank you.
All right, stay on the phone. You all right, buddy?
Okay. All right.
All right.
Go ahead, drop one. I'm by the radio now.
All right, hang up the phone, bud.
All right, well, bye.
And for the record, that was Exhibit 4.
That 911 call was Exhibit 4. Okay. Now we're ready to proceed with our first witness.
Okay.
Frank Piazza.
Okay.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the evidence you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Okay. Good morning, sir.
You may inquire.
Good morning, Mr. Piazza. Please state your name for the record.
Frank Piazza.
What is your occupation?
I am a forensic audio and video analyst.
What is a forensic audio-visual analysts do?
We handle audio and video evidence for trials, for law firms, government agencies, and help prepare it for trials.
What brought you to that aspect of the profession? What was your background?
My background, going back to 1996 specifically, I am a business owner of a recording and production studio in New York City called Audio Paint, and throughout the years and numerous clients, different industries, a lot of experience handling this type of audio and video had started.
Prior to owning your own business, what type of education did you have? What did you come up doing?
Yeah, so I attended the Berklee College of Music for 2 years in Boston, and there I studied general music courses and audio engineering courses as well, and that's where I started to enjoy the process of recording audio and microphones and things of that nature. After Berklee College of Music, I attended a community college in a local town called Rockland Community College in New York.
And have you, before this case, been involved in other cases where you were called upon to do some sort of audio or visual forensic analysis?
Yes.
Where did you start doing this? Where was your business originally?
So this particular portion, the forensic side of audio and video, began in the year 2000 for me. A few years after owning the studio, I had an opportunity in New York City to work with the Southern District of New York on numerous trials that they had started, and at that time digital evidence was new and they needed someone to help them. Additionally, I also worked with defense, criminal defense lawyers on a very large case. So it happened very quickly, and we transferred our experience in the studio handling audio into the forensic realm.
And when you say this, you worked on a case with the Southern District of New York, that would be the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern
Yes,
District?
the U.S. attorneys.
So your entree into it was for a prosecution.
Yes.
But since that time, you've gotten involved in cases on both the prosecution and the defense side?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Do you have an expertise or an area of expertise that under certain circumstances enables you to enhance audios so that you're able to determine whether there are sounds on that audio that aren't readily available when the naked human ear hears it?
Yes, there are steps that are taken, including a critical listening stage, software, using different software to help heighten areas and change the amplification of certain areas, the frequencies of certain areas. It's a manual process. It's not an automated process.
I didn't ask you, is your office still in New York?
Yes, it is.
Do you live here in West Palm Beach, though?
Yes, I live in West Palm Beach. I travel back and forth.
And do you do work in both places?
Yes, I do.
All right. So did I contact you at some point and ask you whether or not you could listen to a certain audio tape to determine whether, prior to what is readily hearable by just the naked ear, whether there were any other voices picked up by that recording?
Yes.
Okay. So the first thing I want to talk to you about, though, is the speaker capability of cell phones. Okay? Is this an issue that you've looked at in this case? In other words, how does it generally work that cell phones, in this case it was an Apple cell phone, how does it generally work that those speakers discern between what they want to hear and what they don't want to hear, and so forth and so on?
When you say speakers, do you mean microphones?
Microphones.
Yeah. I'll go off the assumption that everyone who has a cell phone knows that there's an area to speak into it when you're talking. What a lot of people don't know is that many cell phones, most, have multiple microphones on them. There might be another one in the front, there might be another one on the back, in addition to a third or maybe a fourth microphone. Different manufacturers decide how they want to handle it. That microphone array, its purposes go just beyond talking into a cell phone in a conversation. For example, a front microphone might be there specifically for someone to take a video, and the audio might be captured better that way. A rear microphone, same issue. There's also a technique that developers have developed where these microphones work in tandem with each other, and they attempt to identify noises, maybe artifacts that are happening in the area where the person is speaking, and it tries to cancel them out while bringing focus to the voice itself. So sometimes it works well, sometimes it doesn't.
And so the idea is to make it easier for the person on the other end of the line to hear the voice?
Yes, that's
or to
correct.
hear the sound?
Yeah, an extreme example might be your window might be open driving your car and the wind is blowing by, or you might be at the beach and you hear all of that wind. It tries to reduce those kinds of noises, and that categories of noises could be very long.
So these microphones are built to try to eliminate certain sounds that they don't identify as being speaking sounds that the other person would want to hear?
The microphone itself is not specifically built for that purpose, but it has been programmed in by the developer to use that process.
So is that a software application that happens?
Yeah, that would either be in the circuit board. Again, I'm not an expert on cell phones and how they're constructed, but it would either be something that's been in the circuit board, this is a physical electronic approach, or it would be software. There are numerous companies out there that some use software, some don't. Apple is very proprietary. They're not very generous with how and what they do.
So the example I think that you and I have spoken about is how is it that a person can be at a crowded bar, let's say, with lots of people talking, but still be able to have a conversation on the cell phone that the other person can understand without the interference of those other voices. Is that the kind of thing we're talking about, that the phone on its own takes care of that?
Yeah, it does, and sometimes it doesn't do a good job, but sometimes it does. Another word to just be familiar with is proximity, where your mouth, your speaking voice is in closeness, relationship to the microphone. The microphone tends to focus on the loudest sound, and when it can't hear the loudest sound, and it's just general open noise such as barroom background, it's going to pick it all up as a whole.
Now, in this case, were you asked to take a listen to this, as we're calling it, AT&T roadside assistance tape recording, to determine whether or not there might be voices or words that were spoken that were not picked up so that the human ear can hear them without assistance?
Yes.
And did you do that?
I did, yes.
Before you tell us exactly what you did, is there software which is developed which allows you to do this kind of work?
Yes, there are numerous softwares that are available.
So generally speaking, before we get specific about this case, do you need water?
I do.
Let's see. Got an extra water? Yes. I got it. Generally speaking, without getting specific or without even telling us yet which particular software programs you used, generally speaking, how does that work? What is the process when you're going to enhance a recording to make those determinations?
The first stage is the critical listening stage, and that is having taking a listen to the materials with professional headphones, professional monitors or speakers, and trying to identify and put together a little roadmap of anything that might be an anomaly or that seems to be interesting in the recording. And in this case, we were searching for voices. So that stage took place. An area was identified, and that audio recording was imported into a digital audio workstation, which is software. And in that workstation, in that software, we have the ability to then get a visual of what that file looks like.
And again, before we go into any of the specifics, when you say a visual, something appears on a computer screen. Is it a graph?
Yeah, it appears as a graphic. There are two areas, two graphics that are important. One is a waveform. The other is a spectrographic image. The waveform tells us certain things. The spectrographic image tells us certain things.
So as lay people, when we talk about a waveform, are we talking about a line that goes kind of...
Yeah, I mean, that is a specific kind of waveform you're referring to, but yes, there are many different waveforms that have patterns that react to volume, and it's very unique in what it looks like.
And so now you're talking, and there's also a spectrogram which shows what, more peaks and valleys? Or
well, the spectrogram, I'll liken it to if you were to have an X-ray taken of a bone, and you would see very specifically a lot of details. Well, referring back to the spectrogram of an audio file, it will reveal visually many details that a waveform cannot, and those details are very specific frequencies, harmonics, the time, very accurate in time, and the amplitude of the volume of some of the characteristics in the recording.
I should ask you, have you been accepted in federal and state courts as an expert in the area you're talking about now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, so that we're clear then, the part of this analysis that you're talking about is the visual analysis of it rather than the audio analysis, correct? In other words, you're seeing a spectrogram or waves on the screen.
Yes.
And do those help you identify the areas that you might need to focus on for the audio to see? In other words, can you see it in that way to know where to listen, so to speak?
Yes, that's true.
Okay. And did you take this AT&T Roadside Assistance recording and did you run it through certain software programs?
Yes, I did.
And what programs did you run it through?
There were two specific programs. One is called Pro Tools, which has been available for a very long time. That is my digital audio workstation, if you will. A second one was called RX2, which it produces the spectrogram, a very nice, clean version of that. And then for creating exhibits later, it was put into a software called Final Cut Pro, and that helped with the graphics and things like that.
Okay. And did you do, with our recording here, our AT&T recording, did you do that and use the three programs that you just talked about?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Did it become apparent to you whether there was or there wasn't a human voice spoken in the seconds before we all can hear, for lack of a better term, the word "huh" spoken by Mr. Jones?
Yes.
And regardless of whether the word was "huh" or it wasn't "huh," except that that's how we'll refer to it, it was "huh."
Yes,
Okay.
that's correct.
And did you do an analysis to determine whether there was a human voice spoken in the seconds before Mr. Jones says "huh"?
I did, yes.
And was there a human voice spoken?
Yes, there was.
Were you able to determine whether or not that human voice belonged to Mr. Jones?
Yes, I was able to determine that it was not Mr. Jones's voice.
And what was the analysis that you used to determine that it was not Mr. Jones's voice that you were able to hear on the program?
Very specifically, I mentioned the word proximity earlier. Throughout the AT&T call or the Allied call, Mr. Jones is with his phone. He is near the microphone, and he does not move from that phone until Mr. Raja and Mr. Jones begin to have a direct one-on-one conversation. Prior to that, he stays in that one specific area with his phone. So microphone proximity, the quality of his voice and the closeness of his voice is very identifiable, whereas this human voice we're discussing is not part of that proximity. It's a very different approach.
And just to follow up on that, when we reach the stage where Mr. Jones gets out of his car, he's still in fairly close proximity to the phone?
Yes, but that does diminish.
Okay.
Yeah.
And were you able to determine then that the human voice that you have identified was not Mr. Jones's voice?
That's correct. It was not Mr. Jones's voice.
Were you able to determine whether the human voice that was spoken before the words "ha" came from the AT&T or the Allied call center?
Yes, I'm able to determine it was not one of those voices.
And how can you do that?
This particularly, there are two areas to focus on here. One, acoustics. This room has an acoustic. It's a large room with a large ceiling, and it has a reflection. The call center is a very live, reflective room. You can hear the echoes or the reverbs or the acoustics. All of the voices that are picked up within that room have that acoustic attached to it. So they do stand out differently than other voices.
Now, you've said that through the use of these two software programs that you're able to identify another voice. Are you able to identify what that voice says in the moments before Mr. Jones says "huh"?
No.
Are you able to determine that it's a human voice?
Yes.
To what percentage that it's a human voice?
100%. It's a human voice.
Please turn off your phones.
Were you able to determine whether or not that voice was Officer Raj's voice?
No, I cannot be certain it was Officer Raj's voice.
Were you able to determine characteristics of it which would make it possible that it was Officer Raj's voice?
Yes.
And those characteristics would be what?
Well, a few areas. Again, I talked about acoustics. That particular voice and other voices recorded of Mr. Raja are in an outside environment. There's no reflection. It's just a very dead air around it, and those voices do not behave like an inside environment. So I place that voice outside. Two, within the frequency range or bandwidth, very specifically, that human voice identified shares many, if not the same characteristics of Mr. Raja's voice that occur later on in the recording as well.
And does it not share those characteristics with Mr. Jones's voice?
The only characteristic it shares is that all voices are in this particular frequency range, but the proximity rules out Mr. Jones's voice being that of the human voice that was detected.
And also, I think you said this, but rules out anyone from the call center, correct?
That's correct.
Now, we're going to show this on the screen, and we're going to hear it. were you ever able to determine the words that were spoken by the voice in the seconds before Mr. Jones says, huh?
No, I could not determine those words.
Does that relate to, the reason you aren't, does that relate to just the general characteristics of the microphone on the cell phone and the proximity issues?
Yes, there are numerous.
Okay. Now, would this be a good point for you to come down and show us both the visualization and allow us to hear what you've determined to be a voice?
Sure.
Okay. And again, is it going to sound like a voice to all of us?
Probably not.
Is there any question that it's a human voice? I think you said
It is a human voice.
And are you able to just based on the various factors that you said, give us a percentage as to whether or not that voice belonged to Officer Raja?
Yes.
What percentage do you place on that?
50% or higher.
Okay. All right. With the court's permission, I'm going to ask you to go where you need to go, and let's explain to her first what she's about to see and hear on the screen, okay?
Yeah.
So what will the judge be seeing and what will she be hearing?
Your Honor, I'm going to play a series of a clip of the audio that was taken from the recording. We're not going to hear the whole entire in its length, just the area that we're focusing on today, which will demonstrate the human voice. I'm going to play the original, unenhanced, the way we all received it. I'm going to play another enhanced copy and a third enhanced copy. You're going to hear that in audio form first. I'm also going to play, with help of the graphics on the screen, those same three playing in a spectrogram the way it would play as I would see it, and you're going to get an opportunity to see it in that spectrogram as well. They're going to be those same three versions. Again, I'm going to play those same three versions with the spectrogram, and I'm going to offer graphic pointers that will demonstrate and give you an opportunity to see see what I see exactly without you having to determine what you're seeing. I'll make that decision for you, and you will either agree or not agree with it.
Okay. Those going to be the red circles?
Yes, yes, those are going to be red circles.
So what will the red circle designate for Your Honor?
Yeah, the red circles will designate the human voice in question and all of Raja's voices in the recording. But you will hear Mr. Jones's voice as well.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay?
Sure.
Yep.
So where do you need to go now to do that?
I'd like to come down here, and before I actually play the audio, I just want to give a very quick tutorial on what you're looking at as a spectrographic image so you can understand and everyone here can know what they're seeing and not feel in the dark about it.
Okay.
I'd rather that it turn towards Your Honor. Than, if we have to compromise here, I'd rather it turn more towards Your Honor. Okay,
One more thing.
yeah, let's speak into a microphone here.
I would prefer, for the maximum listening quality, for you to use headphones. I have multiple headphones here up at the table that's been set up for anyone who needs to use them. Can we run a headphone to the judge's area, or do we have enough for that? We don't have a feed for that, so if it's okay, can we ask the judge?
So with the court's permission, would you be willing to step down to hear the headphones that we have set up?
Before we do all this, can I see the parties up here just for a moment, please?
Yes.
Can I see the state and defense, please? Sure, absolutely. All right, so for the record, the parties are stipulating that there was a voice and something said prior to Mr. Jones saying, huh. That is what the state and the defense are stipulating to at this time.
So do I assume that Mr. Piazza would be excused at this point?
Well, I don't know if they wanted to cross-examine.
No, Your Honor, I cross-examined.
Okay.
If he's going to be cross-examined, then we can't accept stipulation because we need to put on the entire presentation. So if there was a stipulation, fine, but if there's not a stipulation as to...
You mean a stipulation with the exclusion of the state being able to cross-examine? Is that,
Then we'll go ahead and show that.
okay? So do you need me to come down and,
Okay, so let's proceed with it, and Your Honor, the headphones are set up here, and one of you guys help the judge.
Yeah, we're just going to need a moment or two. You can stay there right now, and then I'll call you up, if that's okay. Just since the screen's in position here.
And that you have your headphones.
Your Honor, I just mentioned that I wanted to show you what a spectrographic image looks like to give you some perspective what you're going to be seeing when I play back the audio. So this is the original version of the file. It's a small clip. The bottom portion that moves from left to right are seconds. So it gives you kind of perspective. This is roughly a 31 second clip that you'll be hearing. The right side demonstrates the frequencies that the voice is captured or has been originally recorded, and you can see it stops at 3,000. This is important just to mention because wireless companies, AT&T, Verizon, their signal bandwidth is very limited, and just the short version reasons why is because they're passing so many millions of calls, you know, whether it is a second or a minute, I don't know what the numbers are, and they can feed this limited bandwidth much easier, and so people can receive them. So on the right side are the frequencies talking about the very specifics about what we're hearing. What we're able to see in this original recording, you might see some horizontal lines going through, and if you really come down, or if you can see from there, they're actually broken up. There is a space in between each one. And then above that, those horizontal lines continue. There is a door chime, or maybe a key chime, that is constant in the recording that the phone picks up. And that is, we're seeing that chime. So we know that that's the chime. You will also see there are brighter areas that go from bottom to top or top to bottom. And these brighter areas are the voices. The brighter, more pronounced areas are capturing the energy or the pressure that it got recorded in the microphone. So if you were to just look at this and say, who is Mr. Jones, you would probably be able to say, okay, the brighter ones must be Mr. Jones's voices, or other loud voice, not necessarily voices, sounds that might be occurring. In this particular call, we have other sounds happening. We have the dispatcher, she's on there. She's breathing. She's typing. Something, I hear banging at times. I don't know if it's her or if it's something happening in the car itself, but all these things are captured, and you can see them. You can identify them, and you can know with confidence what you're hearing, and then when you finally see it, you are into something. So as you see the audio play from left to right, you'll get familiar with what you're seeing and why you're seeing it. Now I want to point out one other thing. This is that same audio file enhanced. This version is now showing you a few different things. First of all, it's showing the louder areas that we talked about, which are brighter, are much brighter, much more pronounced. There are other areas that are brighter that weren't there before, and all the graying behind it. We'll refer to that as noise or artifacts, and these things just get added to audio, and that's what makes it sound very difficult to hear. And you have two sources happening. You have the poor audio being recorded on the phone side with Mr. Jones, and then you have the poor audio being recorded in the call center, those being married together. So you're creating a lot of noise and a lot of extra artifacts, makes it difficult. So that's how a spectrograph is read and how we refer to it when we're listening and get a visual. You have any questions?
That is the third clip, correct? So you're going to be playing three different, the original?
Yes, this is the third clip because initially I'm borrowing these visuals from an older presentation that was already given, but we're not referring to this. But this is the enhanced clip. I do not have this for the third. Yes, I do have this for the third clip. I apologize, but you'll see it in playback form. Okay?
Mr. Piazza, while you're at it,
Yeah.
can you just explain what Her Honor's going to see with the circles? What's that going to do?
Okay. And just giving you a heads up, when we get to that point, you're going to see a timeline move from left to right. You'll see it physically move. It's a vertical line. And as it goes from left to right, you're going to see red circles appear. They're going to come up and they're going to disappear. They're going to give you enough time to focus in on the areas that we're trying to demonstrate, which is Mr. Raj's voice. So I'll prepare that when that happens. Okay?
Okay. Are you ready to?
No, sir. I have just one more thing I want to point out.
Okay.
Okay, and just one more thing, and then we'll move on to the playback of the audio, and we'll get this going. This red rectangular area is demonstrating the very area where Mr. Rogers' voice is very present and very identifiable. And it's in a range that I actually go a little higher. I go up to 1,000, but it's actually below that. But that is the area that we're really focusing on. That's where those voices are occurring. Okay? Thank you.
Just for the record, Your Honor, we object to any red circles around any voices prior to the word "on," since it's already been testified to that there's no certainty that it's the defendant's.
Okay. What would you like me to do now? Want me to step down
Are
and?
you ready for Her Honor?
Wait, I want to understand. Are we able to play? Yep, okay. Okay, we're going to play some audio. If you wouldn't mind, please coming up here and putting on some headphones. What? Yep, do that, please. Put it on very, very quiet. It's not going to adjust.
Okay, ready?
Okay, so this is the original. You've heard this already prior today. You're hearing it again.
Oh my gosh.
Okay, that's the original. Now I'm going to play you an enhanced version.
Why is it not? Is it going to appear on the screen or not?
It will in just a moment.
Okay.
I mentioned before I wanted to start with audio.
Okay.
Okay. Here is
Will
the.
it also be heard on the speakers at the same time?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can make it louder if that's what you need.
But it'll also make the headphones louder?
No, but what I want to avoid, Mr. Lubin, is that I don't want the speaker to then get in the way of this thing. So this is deliberate. Okay? Okay, here is the enhanced version.
I'm good. Yeah, I'm good. Yeah.
Okay, now I'm going to move to the video, and I'm going to play the original. You're going to see a visual of it, and then we'll go on from there. Here it is enhanced.
Stop. I'm good. Yeah, I'm good. Yeah.
Oh my God.
Okay, and here is a second enhancement. And what is being done here is I'm reducing all of the noises that could be distracting us. I mentioned before the typing or some of the noise or the environment things. So you get an even different look at it.
Now, I want to ask you on this enhanced version, it shows a brightened section
Yes,
before you hear Mr. Jones say "huh."
yes.
First of all, have you timed that out? How long prior to Mr. Jones saying "huh"?
6.5 seconds.
Okay. And is the bright section that we just saw that voice that you've been able through enhancement to bring out?
Yes,
Could you show that again and point it out to Ron?
yes, I will. Okay.
Just with your,
Circles, yes or no?
we'll get to the circle.
Okay, okay. You can make it a little louder. Okay, so. I think you're getting a little familiar with how this works. This area right here, at the roughly 2.5, 3 second mark, is the voice in question, the human voice. 6.5 seconds prior to that, which is huh, and then all the responses up to this area. So this is the area that we're really focusing on.
So that, what we just heard is
Yes.
the voice that you were able to, through enhancement, identify, but not identify as a voice, but not when you hear the regular recording.
Yeah, it's there, but it's very difficult to discern between.
And through your process, you've eliminated some extraneous sounds that allowed us to be able to hear what you identify as a human voice.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Now, is there yet another video version of this that you want
Yes.
us to see? Does that contain what you said are circles?
Yes, it does.
And the circles will designate what?
It will designate this area and the smaller areas in between the larger areas, all these areas being Mr. Raj's voice happening. You will hear Mr. Jones's voice, but we will not bring attention to them with graphics.
Can I go back up there and you can turn it, or do you need me to do the?
I think at this point we could have you go back up there, and we'll just use the speaker.
Yes, can you move it a little bit closer, please? Okay, that's fine. Yes, thank you so much.
Okay, Your Honor, I'm just going to play 2 more versions. This is the original version with the circles, and then we'll play the enhanced version you just saw with the circles, so you can get perspective of what enhancement can actually do to an original and how it can end up after that work has been performed. Okay, here is the original with circles.
Stop. I'm good. I'm good. Yeah.
Okay, that's the original. And again, like I pointed out before, the areas have been reduced that we don't want to listen to, but the areas of notoriety are the middle areas, and you will see those get circles. That is everything I would like to demonstrate, unless there's something else you'd need from me.
Okay.
Now, we could go take a seat. So, Mr. Piazza, on the final two audio-visual representations that you've played, you caused red circles to go around the voices of Raja, correct?
Yes.
But just so the record is clear, you did put a red circle around the voice that has the characteristics of Raja, but you have a 50% surety level that it's him. But that was for purposes of just pointing out to Her Honor the new voice that's inaudible, or you don't hear it on the unenhanced version, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And again, to be very clear, it's not Corey Jones's voice, correct?
That is not Corey Jones's voice.
And it is not from the AT&T Allied call center, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And it is a human voice.
It is a human voice.
And to that, you're 100% sure.
Yes, I am.
Okay.
Anything further?
I think that's it. I just want to check. No further questions.
Okay. Cross-examination, Mr. Fernandez?
Thank you, Your Honor.
Mr. Fernandez, hold on one second. Thank you.
Sure. You can inquire.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
How much money have you been paid by the defense up to this point?
I want to give you an exact figure, but I can't, but I'm going to say around $8,000 to $9,000.
So at this stage, you've been paid around $8,000 to $9,000 to come here and provide us analysis that prior to Corey Jones saying the word "huh" with a question mark, there's actually a voice.
That's correct.
And that's basically all you've said here today, is that there's a voice prior to him saying "huh."
Yeah, that's what I was doing today, yes.
And you're sure it's a human voice?
Yes,
And part of that reason is because it has tonality, is that correct?
that's one of the characteristics, yes.
Musical instruments, do they have tonality?
Yes, they do, some do.
Animal sounds have tonality?
They do.
Electronic noise that can have tonality?
Yep.
But you're sure this is a voice?
Yes, this is a voice.
You cannot tell with 100% certainty that it's the defendant's voice, correct?
That's correct.
You, through your expert analysis, can't say that that's the defendant's voice.
Correct.
What scientific methodology did you use to come up with that 50% figure, sir?
There were a few areas that were focused on. One being the acoustics or the environment where that voice in question was recorded. And it is in a very dead air environment, which places it very similarly to the other voices which are in that environment. In this case, Mr. Raj's voices are also in that environment. It falls into a frequency range of roughly, I believe it's between 350 to about 800, very consistent with the voices and the voices of that of Mr. Raja and the voices themselves. And there's also the microphone proximity is telling us that that particular voice was further away from the microphone, and it demonstrates those properties quite accurately.
And you come up with 50% because of that.
Yeah, I'm just comfortable saying that I know that it's not Mr. Jones's voice, and I'm using the consistencies in other Mr. Raj's voice to help me determine that that's a voice.
You're also incorporating the fact that you know Mr. Raja's there. Is that right?
What do you mean, in this courtroom?
No, at the time of the shooting, when he shot Corey Jones, he was present. You incorporate that into your analysis of saying that you're 50% sure that it's him?
Sure, his recorded voice is there, so it acts as an exemplar, if you will, or a comparison piece to help. Yeah.
I mean, realistically, when you say 50%, it's just because you're deducing that there's nobody else present, so there's a good chance it's him. You've got no scientific formula that equates percentages to different type of attributes and then equals 50%, do you?
No, I don't.
So it's just you saying 50% because you're not sure, but you think it probably is him.
I don't have a mathematical equation or able to put in measurable terms the other three factors that place that voice as similar to Mr. Raj's voice or not, but I'm confident that the things I told you just a moment ago, I helped identify it as a voice.
Correct. But no generally accepted methodologies to equate to this 50% notation that you throw that it's the defendant's voice.
No, because if I am able to say an exact percentage, I wouldn't know how I would come up with that percentage. I prefer just to say that you as the listener can help determine that as well as my information that I provided.
And but you just put a percentage on it under direct exam. You said it was 50% sure that it was his voice.
That's correct.
But now you're saying that you really can't come up with a specific percentage.
I'm going to go with 50%. It feels comfortable to me to know that I've done enough to know that there is a possibility that it could be Mr. Rogers' voice. And there's a possibility that it couldn't be Mr. Rogers' voice.
The possibility could be 15%, right?
The odds in whatever way you want to look at it.
Well, probability, if it's probable, it's going to be greater than 50%. Possible is less than 50%. You agree with that?
I do. So can you help me to know what answer you want from these questions?
Well, you're the expert. I mean, that's the difficulty. You're the expert. You're supposed to tell us if you have an expert opinion as to the percentage, what it is, and what it's based on. But you can't tell us that you have a specific basis for 50%. Isn't that right?
I'm basing that particular percentage on the factors I included just now when we spoke earlier.
But without any type of formula because, as in your words, it feels right.
Having listened to thousands of hours and thousands of voices over the years and represented many clients over the years, I feel qualified that my ears, in addition to the methodologies I used to determine that was a voice, would enable me to offer an opinion that it's 50%, sir.
So what you're saying is your ears are the expert part of what you do.
I'm saying that those are included, yes.
You talked about a critical listening stage, and I'm putting that in quotes because that's your term. When you say critical listening stage, that's you just listening to it, correct?
Yes, that's part of it.
And using your ears to focus on the sound of it, is that right?
That's part of it.
And that's part of your expertise.
That's part of it.
Isn't that the large part?
It plays a huge role. It helps determine what your next steps are.
You have no educational degrees, correct?
That's correct.
You've been to 2 trainings in the last over a decade, isn't that right?
That's correct.
You can't tell by your ears whether voices are under stress, can you?
No, that's not my specialty, sir.
How many different voices in the world have the same characteristics of the defendants?
I want to think about that answer. I'm only dealing with the audio recording that I was presented with. So it determines what the characteristics are. Yes, generally, frequency is a global term. Proximity is a global term. Again, I'm not a voice analyst. There's a difference. I'm an audio expert. The voice part of it, apparently there are no matches. Everybody has a unique signature.
But you couldn't match up that sound to the defendant's voice, correct?
Yeah, and a couple of reasons why. The quality of the recording was quite low.
The question was, you couldn't match up that voice to the defendant's, correct?
No, that was not something that, I don't know what you mean by match, but again, I use some of the qualities.
And you're not a voice analyst expert?
No, I'm not a voice analyst, someone who might do voice identification or compare voices, which courts don't even accept. So,
let's talk about courts not accepting. You said that you have been accepted in courts to testify both federal and state, is that correct?
yes.
You've also been precluded from testifying because you didn't meet a scientifically accepted standard previously, haven't you?
No, I have not been precluded. Specifically, what are you talking about?
I'm talking about you being precluded from testifying because you didn't meet a scientifically accepted standard.
If you're referring to a Fry hearing that took place a couple of years ago, the judge did not allow that work in that case.
So you were precluded from testifying because you didn't meet accepted scientific standards.
The process didn't meet scientific standards, not me. I did what I could do.
Not your personal qualifications, just what you're testifying about.
Correct. I was asked to demonstrate in a Fry hearing what is the science behind voice identification.
So you can't tell what was said at that point that we've been discussing, correct?
Yes.
You can't tell if it's a single word or multiple words, correct?
I can tell you there are multiple syllables.
How many syllables?
I believe there are 3, but I would like to listen again and be confirmed of that.
How long did it take for Corey Jones to say, huh?
Excuse me, from where? From that particular section?
Well, you do recall Corey Jones saying the word huh, correct?
Yes.
How long, you talked about 6.5 seconds prior to him saying huh. How long did it take him to say huh? 0.4 seconds.
I didn't measure it, but under a second. You mean like the word spoken? How long does it take for someone to say huh?
No, not someone. Corey Jones. On that recording that you just played multiple times.
I did not measure the length, but having heard people speak before, I'd say the word huh could probably come in under a second.
Is that, but you don't know if that's how long it took Corey Jones to say huh?
No.
How long did it take for that voice prior to huh?
Are you talking about the space after?
I'm talking about that voice that we've been talking about. How long did that voice exist for? Less than a second? 0.5 seconds?
Under a second.
So similar to Corey Jones saying, huh, as far as the amount of time that it took. Correct?
Sure, could be similar.
And you're saying that you believe it's 3 syllables or less, that whatever was said?
No, I didn't say or less. I thought maybe 3 syllables, and then if I had an opportunity to listen right now here with you, we can determine that. I want to point out something also about the quality of the recording. Some of those syllables...
The defense attorney comes up, but that's not part of my question to you.
Okay.
My question to you is, after $9,000, you can't sit up here and tell us how many syllables that voice was, can you?
No.
You obviously cannot tell us what supposedly 50% that defendant said to Corey Jones that made him say, huh?
I've already said I don't know what was spoken.
But you absolutely can discern that once Corey Jones said, huh, that defendant responded with, really? Really? A second time. That's on the audio recording, correct?
I would like to hear it again to confirm that. I'm not focusing on the actual words and the exchanges, sir. I'm focusing on the audio and the properties that the audio display.
So when you just listen to it, and I'm saying you played it half a dozen times, you're telling me that you didn't hear the defendant multiple times say, really?
Like anyone else listening to it, yes, I hear it. But it was not a focus of my work. My work was focused prior to that moment.
You heard the defendant twice in response to Corey Jones say, really? Correct?
I did.
You did not hear the defendant at any time whatsoever say, I'm the police, or can I help you, or is something the matter, sir?
No.
During the last month, the whole month of April and now here, has the defense talked to you at all about any testimony or deposition of Deputy Chief Mark Anderson?
No, I don't know who that
I
person
take it
is.
that nothing whatsoever regarding that has changed any of your opinions here today.
I don't know what you're talking about, sir.
Very good. Your Honor, I'm just going to go. We allowed the witness to testify, to provide his curriculum vitae, and to provide the basis for his testimony, but realistically, we find it objectionable that it doesn't meet any type of Daubert standard. We thought it would be important to at least play out to see how it came out, but we would be objecting at this time to the entire testimony, and also we'll renew that and just argue that the
Do
court
you
really...
believe it meets a Fry standard?
Right, yes, yes.
Okay.
So that's all, Your Honor.
Okay. Redirect.
And again, you don't know what words were spoken by the voice that you're unable to identify.
Yes, that's correct.
So the word could have been police.
Could be.
It could be, can I help you?
Could be.
You talked about the quality of the recording being an impediment here to determining who said what and what was said, correct?
Yes.
You were the subject matter that you were once going to testify on was the subject of a Fry hearing in some other jurisdiction, I think you said, correct?
That's what I believe we were talking about.
Okay, sure.
You testified that proffered testimony by one side or another was subject to some sort of admissibility hearing. I called it a Fry hearing. I don't know if that's what it was, but
Yes.
some sort of admissibility hearing. Yes?
Yes.
And in that case, the court ruled that the subject matter at that time, which was, I think you said, voice identification,
Correct.
didn't satisfy that judge's standards, correct?
That's correct.
That didn't go to your particular qualifications, correct?
No.
Okay. And in terms of your coming to the conclusion that although you can't identify that voice that was spoken 6.5 seconds before Mr. Jones says, that you used scientific methods to determine that it was in fact a voice.
Yes, I did use scientific methods.
And the standards that you used to place a 50% level on it as to that it was similar to Mr. Raja's voice were the standards, were what you use in your trade to make such determinations, such as tonality and frequency, correct?
Correct.
Your indulgence, I don't think I have it. No further questions. Thank you.
Okay, you may step down, sir. Thank you so much. Okay, we're going to take a break. It is 10:18, and we're going to come back at 10:30 after the break, everybody. Okay? Thank you so much.